Good morning to all our listeners. Thanks for joining in. As you said, my name is Steve van Zyl. I'm the National Technical Manager at IOPSA, and my co-host in today's session 2 is Herman Strauss. Just before I kick off, I think we just need to take a few minutes just to run through those very important tips to prevent COVID-19. So, ladies and gents, always remember to wear a mask when out in public, wash your hands with soap or an alcohol-based hand sanitizer. Avoid touching your eyes, nose, or mouth with unwashed hands. Avoid close contact with people who are sick. Cover your cough or sneeze with a flex elbow or a tissue, then throw the tissue in the bin. Clean and disinfect frequently used surfaces and objects. Herman, can we move to the next slide, please? As mentioned, my co-host is Herman Strauss. We presented session 1 to you last week. Just a quick little background. Both Herman and myself do work or do work within the SABS committees. And saying that, Herman, would you maybe just like to introduce yourself to the team?
Well, thank you, Steve. Thanks everybody for the opportunity. Yeah, I'm Herman Strauss. I work as a consultant for various organizations, and I'm happy to work with IOPSA on several projects. And my background, I've been part of SAB's committees and working, testing products, verifying, participating in standards writing for more than 20 years now. So this is a topic I think it's something I can speak on a little bit. But there's a few important things, and I think things that can assist anybody out there who's actually reading a standard, trying to understand what it actually says.
Absolutely, and that can be a little bit confusing when you do that a first time round. So with that being said, Herman, can we then kick off? I think we should just quickly recap, just a very, very high recap of what we spoke about in the last session. So we basically spoke that there are product standards. Those are standards that relate to products, how they be tested. And then we also spoke to those safety and installation standards and that they are different. And then we also had a bit of a discussion regarding what can be found in the table of changes, which is basically those amendments, that first point of call, what has been changed or amended within the standard. We spoke about the forward. And if you recall, we said that the forward is basically an introductory section of a book. That's where you'd find common things, information, those kind of things. And that's always right up front, and that's in the forward. We also spoke to what could be found in the scope. And basically, we said that the scope covers what's in those boundaries of the standard, what's in and what's out, if you recall. Today, we're going to obviously have a chat a little bit about the other things that we do find in standards, like normative references. We're going to touch on some definitions and requirements. We'll look at some annexures and maybe have 1 or 2 examples. But I think before we kick off, Herman, I do recall that in the last session, there were some points raised or questions raised from the audience asking, well, where do we purchase standards? So if you're looking at the slide there, you'll see that the reference is store.sabs.co.za. And Herman's, obviously, we've got a little arrow there just to show everyone that you just need to punch in either the code of the standard or the reference of the standard, or any keywords. And it would then, you just push the search button and it will bring up the relevant standard. Unfortunately, there is always a cost attached to this that belongs to the SABS, the South African Bureau of Standards. Herman, anything that you'd like to make?
Yeah, if I can add on to that, it's not a Google search. It doesn't fix your spelling mistakes. Trust me, that keeps me back a little bit. But the most important, if you know the standard numbers, type in the number, you get the standard quickly, and from there onwards, you just follow the prompts. You can get the standard the same day, normally within an hour or so from the time that you start the process. Well, it doesn't take that long. There's just normally a waiting period for them to validate and send you the standard in between. So the process takes a few minutes. Thereafter, you wait and you receive it and you can continue. Not a hassle.
And just remember, as we spoke last week, as that golden rule, always make sure that you have the latest and the most updated publication and the most recent edition of that standard. Herman, the other question that the audience asked was, are there some basic or common plumbing standards that we could maybe just share with everyone? And I think we've got a nice little bit of a drawing there on the side and just saying, well, these are just some general ones and not all. But if you look on the top left-hand cover, SANS 10252 Part 1, which is the water supply, and then 10254, which are geyser installations and the safety and installation of geysers, the repair, replace and maintenance of those geysers. SANS 10252 Part 2 speaks to the water drainage. So the way I always remember it, if you look right at the top, number 1 is coming in, it's water supply into that building. And then number 2 is the water drainage out of the building. Other common ones is SANS 10106, which is the solar water heating systems. Another one that is also important maybe to mention is SANS 1352, which is for heat pumps. And these are installation standards. Herman, you concur with me?
Oh yes, no, definitely. So look at what are you dealing with. Those are the main standards to get. You will see from the rest of this presentation that it might be necessary for you to get additional standards. It's always recommended, if you can, to get the ones referred out of these ones. But these are the most important ones, which are also incorporated in legislation. So the law says you must know what is in those standards.
Okay, and I think that's maybe a very nice introduction to our next topic, which is normative references. Now, I'm going to read this, and I think it is important that we just spend a few minutes, because when most people say, but I get so confused, I don't understand, and can you maybe explain a little bit? And basically, normative references, and when you see it, it's normally right up front before on a standard. And what it is, it basically says there, what are the other standards that are linked to this standard in order for it almost to, you can't exclude anything, but you have to take this into account. So when you read it on top on your picture that you're seeing, it says reference documents in the standard that are indispensable for the application of this document. So when I see the word indispensable, basically telling me as the reader, man, I can't forget about this. I can't put it on the side. When I'm doing the application of this standard, I have to consider all these other important standards. And we'll take, and I think one of the other slides further on, just basically speak to what is a normative and what is informative, because there's always that slight confusion. And I think Herman are going to just try and explain to you that there is a difference, first of all. But I think the important key message we need to get across is you cannot see a standard in isolation. They almost link together. And we've got a beautiful slide just to show you how many standards are in fact linked to us, as an example to one of the standards that we've mentioned here today, which is SANS 10254 as an example. Herman, anything else you'd maybe like to cover? I know we made a circle around ISO.
Oh, that might have been no. So I think the important thing here to understand, and let's not get into too much detail. ISO, the reason why it's circled is some of this, the national standards are actually adoption of international standards. ISO stands for International Standards Organization. So either you get the international standard or the SANS standard, it's the same thing. The technical content is the same. But don't let this distract you. The long list of standards, don't be despondent with this. In most cases, it's not necessary to have all of these standards. Sometimes where there's a special interest, go ahead, have a look at it. But a simple note, SABS has got offices, as far as I know, at least in Pretoria and Cape Town. They do offer the service where you can go sit and read the standard for free in their library. You can go in, take notes, whatever you need to know. If there's any of these standards that you don't want to buy, but you actually just want to have a overview of it, go into the offices. That service is not charged for.
Right. Everyone, like I said, when I read indispensable, I think it's absolutely necessary. As I mentioned, it cannot be excluded. But I think there's an important word, normative and informative. And if we just have a look, normative is basically the must-dos, and it's prescriptive. It's indispensable. As we mentioned, it cannot be excluded. it must be applied, it's mandatory and compulsory. And then that other word, which is informative, and I think that is the point that I want to make there, that is basically information. It's enlightening, not prescriptive. It's almost got a little bit of a leniency, if I could use those words, but basically consider it when applying a standard, because it has useful information and application. So the difference between normative and informative, guys, basically what you can do, must do, and the other side is that's information that I could use as a person or a reader I need to take into account. Just an example, as I said, just to show you how connected standards are. So I've just used a demonstration in today's webinar just to show you, for example, in SANS 10254, it may not be all of them, but have a look at the relative normative standards that have been mentioned. And I mean, it's as I think we all can agree, it is huge and it ranges across a lot of standards. So think about installing a geyser. So the SANS 10254 is an installation, a safety and installation standard. And then, for example, one of those linked, I'm just going to use one example, would be, for example, 151. So it makes reference as normative. You have to apply that. So that geyser that you're installing needs to have complied, or I'm using for let me just say must have conformed to SANS 151. So I think the picture we're trying to paint is, and it can be confusing. When you see a picture like this, it can be confusing, but it's very important just to remember, just to check what are those other normative standards that I need to take into account when I'm applying the specific standard that I'm working with. And that standards do not work alone.
Yeah, I think to add on to what Steve says, and just to make sure that the people don't think Steve and I disagree on which standards you must buy and which ones not. If I use an example, if you see on this screen, in this block, SANS 1307. So in one of the mandated standards, 10252, it specifies that when a solar water heater is installed, it must be installed in line with the 10106, which is the installation standard for solar water heaters, this one. But it also says the solar water heater must comply with SANS 1307. So, for example, as a plumber, it is not necessary for you to know exactly what goes in the design of the solar water heater. Therefore, it is not one of the standards that you have to have in your arsenal. I mean, then you're going to buy, way too many standards. But it is a very good reference. This is one of those things that if you do get into solar water heaters more, it can be very beneficial if you do actually procure the standard. At the end of the day, it means the standard 10252 cannot exist without this. It means all solar water heaters must comply with this. And at least the minimum reference that you have when you look at a solar water heater is verify that it actually complies with 1307. Ask the manufacturer about that, and so on. I hope that clears it up.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, Herman, just before we move to the next slide. So maybe we could, and I'm sure the next slide speaks to just a very general example, which might be SANS 10252.1. So let's have a look at how those two relate. So as we said, we've got 10254, which made some reference to a normative standard. And if I can just draw your attention to the right-hand side of the screen first. So if you look at 5.2, it makes reference to discharge from valves. And I've highlighted just one small section just to show you how they are interlinked. Wordings might not be 100% exactly the same, but they are linked. So if you look at it, it says number 5 says they're never joined together. And the normative reference is 10252 part 2, and the version that I've got here is 2018. And if it's not an exact same position in that standard, 6.615 says the discharge pipes from safety valves and expansion relief valves shall not be interconnected. And then once again, just to say, well, in 10254, they're never joined together. So slight difference in words, but both very, very, very important, and both need to be checked, because there could very well be an extra requirement that's in one that needs to be applied versus the other one. Anything you'd like to add on that one, Herman?
No, on this one, nothing from my side.
Okay,
great. I think the importance remain. Requirements are sometimes in different standards, and they do talk vice versa with each other, especially 10252 and 10254. And that's why it's important to have both standards and not just one of them.
Right. Our next point of talk is definitions in standards. Well, I think the way I understand definitions, Herman, is it basically explains words or terminology. So I think in the example that we're presenting here on is that consider the word dead leg. So in the definition, to what? Well, let me just start again. Dead leg to you or me might mean something else, or to one of the audience may mean something else. But by having a definition, basically it explains or provides clarity and understanding to the reader that a dead leg means this. So by just sticking to the dead leg can be mentioned, and you're more than welcome to jump in, can be mentioned several times in the standard, but the definition, which is up front and it's covered under the definition, explains what the dead leg is.
Yeah, so this becomes important, especially as you say, where different definitions can apply. Where if you just hear the word and you say, well, there's a rule, this dead leg says 12 meters maximum or 8 meters maximum and so on. But I mean, oh, that's wrong, sorry. To identify exactly what does the standard talk to. So if you read a clause in the standard, there's a terminology you're not sure of. First page to the definitions, that's right up front in the standard, and go and have a look there. On the slide, you'll see at the bottom is the definition that's normally in the front of the standard, and then in the requirement, it makes reference to whatever needs to happen with this dead leg. I can quickly go on, as it's actually part of this whole discussion. What then if there's no definition for this? So an interesting one that we came across the other day, and I thought, well, why not? Let's use this as an example, where the words are not defined in the standard. How do you know what they talk about? So simple: water pipe shall not be enclosed in the same duct as a pipe containing fuel or gas. So then the question was, okay, great. So what is a duct? So there's two images on there. Is a duct. Do we talk about the air conditioning duct? Do we talk about the maintenance shaft in a building? Can a ceiling space be regarded as a duct? When can you put the gas pipes and the plumbing pipes in the same place, and so on and so on? So in a case where something like this happens and you do not know what it is, go to the normal, the few points. Is the word defined in a related standard? So is there any other plumbing standard that define the word duct? If that is the case, then use that definition. Is the word defined in a normal English dictionary? So if no standard is it, what is the normal? I mean, Google the word. There's different dictionaries online, and look at the explanation. Go and have a look at textbooks. I mean, there's a lot of plumbing manuals, plumbing descriptions. Sometimes you can get a description of what that means in the context of plumbing at the definition. Is the word commonly used in this industry? Is this something that you come across often in the industry? Do you know what the term means, even though it might be slightly different from what's published in the English dictionary? And of course, context. Context is very important. So if I summarize this, just use common sense. Use your logic and go and figure out what that word means in the contents of this standard. Steve, your turn. You have anything to add to that?
No, I just think those are great tips. As I said, sometimes you do come across a word that, where and how and where does it fit in, but those are really good tips that we
standards intend to be practical. It shouldn't be read as a it shouldn't become, how to say, it shouldn't hold you back. Getting stuck in the meaning of a word shouldn't be what gives that. Just common sense. What does it mean? What's the intention of this? What's the purpose? And that should give you the guidance.
Well, Herman, there are some powerful words in standards, and as you see in the slide that you're presenting. So, the time we do spend in looking and working through standards, there are those words that I just would like to share with the guys out there. So when you see a word like shall, and I've got a bit of an example at the bottom there that we've pasted. So, for example, any non-compliance shall be reported to the owner and user in writing. That shall is a definite, it's a must, it's an important, and I think that's why we've placed it in red. It has value. It has to be applied. The same as the word must. So when you read a word like it must be obtained or permission must be obtained, it's not this is a recommendation or this maybe or I can. It has power, and it has and I don't know if power is the right word, but it has it's almost like you can't. It's a do. You have to action that.
It's not optional.
There we go. Not optional. And then you get those words like the shoulds that you keep seeing popping out. So now put that as a robot like orange. So it's not a must or a shall, but it should be, for example, done. So for example, just to read, the orientation of the heat pump unit should be such that the heat pump unit is exposed to the maximum. So maybe more of a caution there, but more that, hey guys, you must be aware of this, and you must, you should sit up and listen to that. And then obviously you see a lot of reference to recommendation. And obviously those are recommended practices. And I know we're going to speak to some diagrams and figures that are also basically guidelines, Herman. Anything else you'd like to maybe add to this slide?
I think one of the following slides add a little bit else.
Okay.
This follows on from the previous slide as well. So notes versus requirements. As you say, there's different. There are different words that mean different things. But the standard, you will often find a note, as you see in that example. This was one clause out of 10254, I think. I can't even remember which one. But understand what is the purpose of a note in a standard. The note is not a requirement. When it says note, it means you don't. It's the equivalent of. Well, it's not the equivalent of should or anything. A note gives context. It gives context to the requirement. Sometimes it gives good advice. It doesn't mean when the standard says note, you can ignore it, and it gives valuable information to that. Sometimes it gives you a example of how things can be done. Sometimes it just adds some context and points you to another standard where you can go and find information. So the main message is pay attention to notes, but do not imply a note or use a note as a strict rule that you always have to comply with. Again, use logic, use common sense on that one. That leads on to figures as well. So there's lots of images in the standards. And I want to use an example of something very specific that we do come across. SANS 10254 gives a whole series of images, figures that explains installations, that show how installation should be done. So how do you treat a figure like this? And this is the important part that you have to understand. A figure in itself is not a requirement. All the requirements are in the text. The text describes what is required and what's not. But there are different ways that the text can refer to the figure. If the text says, you shall do the installation as shown in the figure, then it's a shall. Then you have no option. Whatever is in the figure is what you have to do. However, in cases like 10254, where the text actually read figures 2 to 10, that's a whole series of different installation figures, show the details of a variety of typical installations. They also serve as a guide to the basic requirements for systems not covered exactly by these figures. So the text in the standard is explicit. It says, you know what, these figures are great examples of things that you can do, but it is not a requirement as such. In other words, you can't go back and say, well, the figure says I must have this component at that place. If the text says the component must be at that location, yes, then it's a requirement. The figure is just the example. We've seen some examples where there were big arguments about the requirements, where they say, well, I'm not sure what the text says about this part. As an example, the height of the vacuum breaker on this one. There's some error showing what the height of the vacuum breaker should be. But if you read the text gives a lot more conditions to consider for installing a vacuum breaker. It allows you to have it at a lower height, for instance, if it is 750 millimeters apart. I mean, all of those things can't always be put in a figure. And that's why I say don't use the figure as the ultimate reference. The ultimate reference is the text in the standard. Steve, before we move to the last slide, you have some comments on this one?
No, I think I've got a question, and it's into the last slide that I really want to just ask you just to maybe explain to the audience where those requirements are required and they need interpretation. And I think our next slide basically is what I'm driving to or moving to. So if you look at that requirement, it reads, unless galvanic action is unlikely to occur or unless effective measures are taken to prevent such deterioration, metal pipes of different materials shall, as far as possible, not be connected to one another. So there's a little bit of interpretation, as you saw on the heading that I've put up there. Could you maybe just try and explain that a little bit better to us? So maybe just explain better so that we have a better understanding of that, because there is some thought that's got to go into that kind of definition. Or
oh yes, no, of course, we have to think about stuff from time to time. So let's just get clarity. We're not going to talk about what to do with galvanic action. That's a technical topic. We're not talking about the technical side now. The importance here is when you come across things like this, the first reaction that we've come across is people say, oh no, this says unless, and it says as far as possible, which means, nah, don't really have to. I can skip over this one. That is not the case. It is the same if I go back to your previous slide, using the word should. When the standard says you should do this, it doesn't mean, nah, don't worry, don't bother, it's not necessary. It means you have to try. So especially the word as far as possible. If you decide that it is not possible to do so, and therefore you do something else, then you have to be able to show why. In other words, it plays a, not a burden, but it's your responsibility to define why you have made the decision, unless this or that, you have to be able to show why you were able to say, no, this is not the case, and therefore I will do that. So it's not a get out of jail free card. It is a requirement that places a responsibility on you to define, to illustrate, and to use your technical knowledge to explain that.
Steve and Herman, I see there are no questions from my side. Is there anything you guys would like to add before I end off? Maybe let's start with you, Steve.
When we said let's talk about this topic, I thought, it's easy because I understand it and it's easy for me, and for Herman it's easy and we understand that. But we even going through the webinars and over the 2 sessions, it's trying to get that information across that makes sense. And I do believe that when you read a standard, it can be confusing, it can lead to it. And all I can say is, if you do have any questions on both, either the first or the second session, for those who did write or email us last week, thank you very, very much. We'd love to engage. If there are any questions, you're driving or you're heading to work and you're thinking of more and you just, you want to ask, feel free. Herman, do you want to just put up my email address there, please? And even your email, if possible, if you could just, I think it should be a click away there. But if not, it's technical@iopsa.org. And then Herman, do you want to just shout out your email address?
It's easy enough to contact us through the what do you call it, the system that you book the course on. The important comment I'd like to make, and I think I want to encourage everybody, standards is not difficult to understand. Yes, a standard is written different from a normal storybook. It is written in such a way to try to be technical accurate. When you're being technical accurate, it doesn't read as like a storybook. But if you just sit down and you read it, if you don't understand it first time, read it the second time, it will start making sense. And at the end of the day, it is only the requirement in the standard that is that's the requirement. It's not how a specific person interpreted it. The rule is the requirement of the standard, and that is why it is so important for us all to refer to or to have a copy of that, to look at that, and to use that as the ultimate reference.
Thank you to all our attendees for joining us this morning. I'm going to go ahead and end the session now.